Good everyone. I hope you're having an amazing day. So today I'm going to talk about another pattern that's the remote call in. Now, like I said in my previous episode, this is not a hands-on session. This is an architecture discussion session. Now, it's important that you need to sit with your architect, Salesforce architect or integration architect to understand the right pattern before you go and develop a solution, right? Because if you go and choose a wrong architecture, right, then it might cost the company more money down the line, fixing the problems that comes out of choosing a bad architecture, right? That's why architecture plays a very important role. That's one of the reasons why I'm teaching you this, about the different patterns, which you can refer if you're dealing with an integration. Okay, now why do we need a remote calling? Excuse me. So we use this pattern generally if you have a remote system, right, who wants to invoke Salesforce, right, to either update or query a data. Let me draw this here. So, excuse me. So we got a Salesforce here, and we got remote systems, auto management system, right? That's the typical classic example we're using. Um, okay, okay. So now, if the auto management, right, if it wants to invoke the Salesforce, right, um, if it wants to invoke in this way, to query or update a data or wanted to push the data, then this pattern is very useful. And this pattern is useful if you want to wait for a successful completion and updates the response back in Salesforce. Okay, so it works as well. Now, before you consider using this pattern, you have to ask a few questions, right? So, does each transaction operate against a single Salesforce object or multiple or related objects? Okay, so you have to ask this question. And what's the format of message? For instance, is it a SOAP or REST or both over HTTP, right? And what's the message size? Is it relatively smaller or large? Okay, so before you start with any kind of integration, right, these are the questions you need to ask. Is the transaction processing required, right? And what's the extent to which you are tolerant of customization in Salesforce? So there are a few things you need to ask yourself before you choose any pattern, not just the remote calling or if, you know. Um, and is the purpose of the remote call to Salesforce is to notify Salesforce of an event which has happened externally using an event-driven architecture, right? So you need to check that out. So, you know, so it's something might have triggered an order management, right? Let's say an order get created. So do you want that information to be notified in Salesforce, right? Whether the order number get pushed into Salesforce. So that kind of questions you have to ask, right? It's not about okay, just use an external services, just call in the API, use the flow, get the job done, So there are different aspects to it, right? Or you can't come up with a solution, say okay, let's use an ETL tool, right, which can be used as an orchestration tool as well. And ETL tools pulls the information from an order management, and then that which in turn push the data to Salesforce. That's one of the solution, but is it going to work for your requirement? That you have to ask, right? Okay, so like I said, um, this pattern is very used if the remote system wants to either query or update data, and the data volume sent and received is low, right? If you are after a massive amount of data, then this integration pattern will not work. Okay, so that's the thing you have to keep into consideration. And then another thing I've talked about, the kind of the message that's sent is an XML format, or I mean, does it support SOAP, or is it over the REST, right? Okay, so now we have talked about this, right? When we are talking about the SOAP or when we talk about the REST, right? We talk about APIs, okay? So we got an APIs, right? SOAP APIs, okay? So Salesforce provides a SOAP API that a remote system can use, okay? So let me put it here. So we are looking at a solution now, which is a part of a remote call. Okay. So what I meant by that is that order management can consume the Salesforce API to push the data back to the Salesforce, right? So that's what I meant by part of a remote call operation, right? Where at remote, an external system is pushing the data or querying the data from Salesforce or pushing the data into the Salesforce. Okay, so now I'm going to use the best fit. I understand that architecture discussion can be boring, but it's not. The thing is, if you're a developer, right? I mean, I've been a developer for many years, right? I love the developing part. I like the hands-on part, but you have to understand it's very important to understand the business process. It's very important to pick up the right technology and solution, right? It's just not about writing code because writing just about the code were gone long days ago, right? It's not about that. It's about because Salesforce integrated with so many systems, right? Out there, integrates with SAP, integrates with Oracle, it integrates with Jira, it integrates with whatnot. So it's important that you need to have a discussion with an architect, or if you don't have an architect, it's your responsibility to pick up the right tool and read about the information which tool to use. Okay, sorry I digress, but I wanted to make sure that you guys understand why I'm doing this architecture discussion, right? So that when you are dealing with integration, you don't make mistake. I mean, I've done that mistake, right, when I started out, because I like, oh, okay, this tool is popular, let's use it. So this is where people make mistake. It's not about the popularity of the tool. It's what works for your requirement for your business process, right? It's all about business process. Okay, everything revolves around business process. That's the reason why you're building a solution in the first place to support a business process, right? So okay, all right. So like I said, Salesforce exposes an API. So we got SOAP, right? We got REST APIs. Okay, so let me put that down here. So you can expose, you know, the SOAP API. You can expose the REST API. So you can go to connected apps and expose the API with all the credentials. So I talked about in the past many times how to do that. So I'm going to do REST API. So in this case, see, we are not dealing with the bulk data, right? If you're dealing with the bulk data, then you have to rely on the bulk API, okay? So this is not a best fit, this design pattern. So this integration pattern will not be a good fit if you are dealing with, if the external system wants to push the millions of record at the time, right? It's not a good fit. Okay, so if you wanted to do a smaller amount of data, smaller chunk of data, then this approach would work. Okay, so like I said, SOAP is one of the thing, and so let me mark this. The SOAP API is considered as a best fit. REST API is considered as a best fit as well. Okay. Now, what is the SOAP API used for, right? So Salesforce, as you know, obviously provide a SOAP API that a remote system can use, right? So they can use to publish events to notify your Salesforce. So you can use this SOAP API to publish the change that happened in the order management system. It can use to query data in your org, like if you want to query an account or if you wanted to query tax information, you can do that. And it can also create, update, and delete data. That depends upon the permission you give to a user, integration user. So one thing I always wanted to tell that if you are creating a new user, which will be used as a part of integration user, please do not give that user a sysadmin profile. That will be disaster because you will give complete access. Okay, so that's not what we want. Only give a limited access to what a system should do. Let's say order management should have only access to account API, product API, customer API. That's what order management should have access to. You should only give access to those objects, okay? And depends if you want to give. I mean, you shouldn't be giving a write access to a product for order management system, okay? So you have to keep that into consideration. So before you design a solution, okay? Um, so yeah, so that's what the SOAP API you can do. So now in SOAP APIs, you have, we have Enterprise Vistal, which is provides a strongly typed Vistal that is specific to the Salesforce org. And another one, we have something called Partner Vistal, which actually is a loosely typed Vistal that's not specific to Salesforce org. Okay. So that's the whistle which get generated when you are dealing with the SOAP so that they can use it. Okay. Now, when you talk about the security aspect of the SOAP, right, the client which executes the SOAP API, right, which is the order management system, must have a valid login and obtain a session to perform an API calls, because obviously you need to, before a Salesforce and order management system does a handshake, right, using a SOAP API, it should have a security credentials. You have to use the credentials, right, in place. Okay. Now, when you talk about the transaction and commit behavior, right? There's something called transaction behavior, right? By default, right? If you're someone who has done API, okay, each API calls allow for partial success if some records are marked with errors. Okay, so that's one of the thing. So like I said, this API is not usable. It's not suitable if you're wanted to deal with bulk data. So you need to look at the bulk API. Okay. So that's for the SOAP. And now we are dealing with a REST API. So now you know about the REST API, right? Because Salesforce do provide the REST API. Like I said, you can go to connected apps and expose the REST API. So now why do we need the REST API? Like I said, order management wanted to push the data, publish the event, right, to notify to Salesforce that something has happened. Okay. And then if it wants to query an account or product, you can do that, and create and update and delete the data, you can do that as well. Okay. so now um, so now you might wonder, right, why do I have to choose the REST, or why do you have to choose the SOAP, right? That's a pretty good question. Right now, REST API, right? Now REST API, if you know, it exposes the resource, right, like um, entities or objects as URLs, and you often use HTTP verbs, right? The get, put, you can post, right, to define the CRUD operation. Okay. Now, unlike SOAP, right, you know, REST API require no predefined contract, right, and it can use XML or JSON, whereas in SOAP, right, it uses only it does require a pre-defined contract, and it supports only XML. Okay, and so what that means that REST is mostly like a loosely coupled, whereas SOAP is not a loosely coupled. Okay, and another reason for using a REST is that REST API is lightweighted and provides a simple method for interacting with Salesforce. Okay, now you can use this if you're using a mobile app, okay, so that you can, as well as the web apps, right? So that's what the REST is very powerful, because it's very easy to integrate. And JSON, if you're dealing, if you ever worked with the JSON, right, it's very easy to understand and parse. XML, I understand that XML. I mean, not many people will love to work with XML, but that being said, XML is not too bad, right? If the SOAP is the only option, might as well go for it. I mean, if it again depends, right? I mean, if you're building for the future, then I would go for a REST API. But if you're a development team, right, if you're in a company where development team is not comfortable whatsoever with using REST API, then SOAP can be a great alternative as well. Okay, both are the best fit, as I said. If you can use the SOAP API, you can use the REST API. Okay, so that's now, now the security, right? As we talked about the security aspect for the SOAP, so for the REST is pretty much the same. Like the client executing the REST API must have a valid login to obtain a session to perform an API. So it should form a handshake. It should be in the form of a session ID or a session or access token. Sorry, for if you're using auth or bearer token, right? Sometimes use some of the APIs use just the username and password, which in my opinion is just a crap, because that's a compromise to the security, because username and password is just not good enough. Just the username and password. So it's always good to use auth, but just read about it. Well, it's important to understand the security aspect of it. And now, transaction behavior is pretty much the same, right? As I said, by default, each record is treated as a separate transaction and committed separately, right? So the failure of one record, right, it will not cause the rollback of other record change. Um, so you can't use this API for the bulk data. Like I said, if you wanted to, you push them, more than 500,000 records, then you got to use the REST-based bulk API. Okay, um, so that's the best part of the REST API. Now let me talk about some suboptimal solution. Okay, so the first one is we can talk about the Apex web service. Okay, so I mean, okay, let me put it here. You know what? Let me delete this one. Let me talk about the suboptimal solution in the next page. Okay, it's more cleaner. So this one I'm going to say sub. Um, the reason why I use the Jamboard, right? Because I like to do stuff on drawing board because I don't have a drawing board to show. Optimal. Okay, that's great. And it's you can put down your thinking when you're doing stuff on a design board or drawing board. That's the way I like to explain. I don't like to do slides. Slides are okay. I mean, if you wanted to do a big theory session, then slides are great. Some people love slides. For me, it's okay if I'm doing something to a customer, right? So I do like to do the slide, but if I explain to a technical people, right, a technology team, then I prefer to go for the drawing board aspect so that I can get their input, I can get their feedback, right? And I just wanted to, things to be like a more like an active session, right? Rather than a passive session where where I'm the only one talking. But in this case, unfortunately, that's the case because we don't because it's not a live session. So I'll probably do one live so that I can get your feedback. You can ask me questions. That's the way I prefer, right? So, but yeah. Okay. All right. So Apex Web Service. This is not a great solution for it. The reason why it is because, you know, Apex class methods, right? That can be exposed as a web service method to external application, right? Because where you customize your own code to expose it as an SOAP. So what happens is like this method, right, is an alternative to SOAP API, which we talked about before, right? And it's typically used only when the following additional requirement must be met, right? So for instance, right, if you wanted to create an account, contact, an opportunity, all in a single transaction. So usually what happens is, right, you have an API, you talk to or a SOAP, right? So Salesforce expose account API separate, contact API separate. So if you wanted to create an account, right, you have to call an account API first in a single transaction. Then in another transaction, you have to consume a contact API and create a contact, right? So if you know what I mean. But if you wanted to do everything in a single call, right, you want to create a contact, you want to create an opportunity, you want to create a account. So if you wanted to use everything, then you have to customize your code. So that's where the web services API you have to do. And custom logic must be applied on Salesforce side before committing. Now, the advantage of using a web service, right? It has to keep into consideration over the drawbacks. What I meant by that is like, the code is not always a good solution. Okay, it is an overhead. You got to maintain the code, right? When the Salesforce changes an API, you have to upgrade to the latest API. Let's say you're working on an API version of an Apex 51. Okay, now your Salesforce changes new API version. So if the Salesforce releases a new API version, they might do some kind of modification to the Apex code or some of the stuff, and then it becomes your responsibility to test it, right? What happens if you change, say, from 51 to 60, right? Your code might work, it might break. Okay, so that's like a maintenance overhead. Okay, now if you're using um, Salesforce out of box API, then you don't have to worry about it. Okay, so just have to weigh the drawback and the advantage. Okay, now another one similar to the web service like SOAP, you have Apex REST service is pretty much the same. Like um, the SOAP we talked about, it's not an optimum solution. It's a suboptimal solution. It's not a best fit. So like I said, if you wanted to create an account, contact, opportunity in a single transaction, you wanted to create an REST API, you can do that using a Apex code. So it often implement the REST methods like HTTP post, get, whatever. Now, unlike SOAP, right, there's no need for the client to consume a service definition contract. Like I said, it's loosely coupled when it comes to REST, unlike the web service, because a web service or a SOAP, there is a need of a predefined contract, whereas in case of REST service, there's no predefined contract, okay? And so, yeah, now there's another API which is very good, which I've been talking about. If you would have paid attention to what I'm talking, that bulk API. Now, I'm not talking if it's a great fit or it's a bad fit, but the bulk API, it's only a good fit if you're dealing with a massive amount of data, right? If you're dealing with, say, more than 500,000 data. So let me say bulk API. So if you're someone who deals with more than 500,000 records, right, and the system wants to push it to the Salesforce, right, then the bulk API is the best to go, right, hands down. There's no other better alternative, because if you're gonna push um, the data using a simple REST service, then it may not be a great solution, I'm afraid. Okay, so now, um, so Now, we're going to talk about error handling, which is very important. Now, error handling plays a very, very, very important role, because, as you know, that in every integration, error handling plays a very critical role, because, it makes no sense, like, if you are building an integration and there's no way to record an error, or there's no way to monitor an error, because then if something goes wrong, client might wonder what the heck is going on. I mean, it shows everything's working, but there's no transaction coming through, right? So, I mean, that's a very, very bad scenario to be in, because then it shows that, I mean, it gives a very bad impression about your development team, because the client will think, that means the developer team has no idea you are not following the business process. Okay, so now in error handling, all the remote calling methods, right, standard or custom APIs, it often requires the remote system to handle any subsequent errors, right, such as timeout and the management of retries. You can also use middleware if you're after, right? So there should be a retry mechanism in place as well, right? For instance, you push the data, a custom retry. I mean, you got to build it, right? If a quality of service requirement dictates it, okay? Because you don't want the duplicate data to, for instance, you are pushing. Um, so let me put that Salesforce. So, come on, and it's gonna do order management, right? Okay, now let's say you created an order. Um, Order get created here. Let's say, you know, and information needs to be updated here. Okay, so um, for the sake of argument, let's say we got an order management system here. Sorry, we got an order information here, and we got an order information here. So we wanted to push that information here, right? Now, say a change happened here, okay? And now, for whatever reason, API connection got disconnected or out of sync, or right. So that data didn't push through, okay, to Salesforce. Now, next time when it comes live, right, you wanted to push the data again, but what could might have happened? You have to make sure that there is no duplicacy, okay? So in this scenario, it's perfectly fine. It pushed the data here. Now, think about a scenario. You want to push a newly created record from order management to Salesforce, and API has been successful, but the response, right, for some reason, the response failed, right, to order management. So the order management thinks, oh, that means, there is an issue with the push request to the Salesforce. So let me try it again. So you're going to push the same record next time again, but you have to keep very one thing into consideration, that the Salesforce should not be duplicating the data. So you have to keep that consideration, design into consideration, right? You have to keep the duplication. What happens if the API fails? What happens if the SOAP calls fails? What happens out of 1,000 records, 200 records fails, right? How are you gonna reconcile those, right? So you should not be having a duplicate data, okay? So this is very important. This is extremely important because the last thing you want a client to see, duplicate information floating around, and the data is precious, okay? Data plays a very critical role in today's time, right? If you're mucking around that production data, imagine the implication, right? Okay, now let's talk about the security, which is my favorite topic because, as usual, security plays a very important aspect. You're talking to two different systems, right? Salesforce. How do you know that, which one is which? Okay, so the security is very important. Okay, let me put it here. And if you are an integration designer, developer, if you don't talk about security, that's not good enough. Absolutely not good enough. Okay, so let's talk about the SOAP API. Okay, so the Salesforce, as you know, it supports secure socket layer, right? SSL, and the TLS, that's the transport layer security protocol. So the remote system, right, must log in using a valid credential to obtain a session ID. Okay, so that means an auto management. If the remote system has a session ID, okay, then it can call the API without explicit logging because you can pass the same session ID, right? So, for instance, when you talk about an access token, right? So, if the Salesforce, so what happens is that, okay, let me give you a very simple scenario here. So let me explain to that Salesforce. I mean, I love this security part very much. It's my favorite part in the integration security. So, okay, order management. So so okay, so it's okay. So this is so Salesforce order management wants to get query account object from Salesforce. Okay, for whatever reason. Now, so before it performs any query operation, right, using an API, it should form a handshake between a Salesforce and order management. Okay, now the way to do that, let's say Salesforce has exposed its API using auth, right, using connected apps. So order management has to get the access token. Okay, so now it has to request for the generation of an access token, and now the Salesforce is satisfied, saying, okay, here's the access token requested. Next time, for Salesforce to know if the order management is the same guy Salesforce talked to before, order management has to pass the access token back. Okay, and access token has a time life. I mean, it won't last for like years. It just maybe for 3 hours. So once the access token, as long as the access token is active, it's not expired, order management can pass the access token to the Salesforce without requesting for a new one. Okay, so that's what I meant about the security aspect of it when I talked about it. Okay, so that is for the REST API. Okay, so in case of SOAP, you have to pass the session ID, right? If the remote system already has, like I said, has a valid session ID, it can call it without an explicit login, right? So now for other web service and the REST service, which I talked about, which is you built using your Apex code, it's always recommended that remote system to establish an auth trust for authorization. Okay, same goes with the bulk API, right? Now, um, as far as the data volumes is concerned, like I said, it is not for a very high volume. If you wanted to use the high volume, you have to use the bulk API. So for the SOAP API and Apex Web Service APIs, you know that they are synchronous, okay? So the timeouts do apply. There's something called session timeout and there's something called query timeout, okay? So when you talk about the session timeout, right? The session timeout out there, right? It gets out if there's no activity based on Salesforce organization session timeout setting. And we got query timeout. So each SQL query, right? We talk about the SQL query. Sorry, not SQL, SQL query. It goes and it has an individual timeout of 120 seconds. Okay, so you have to keep that into consideration. Now, when you're logging, right? Since I talked about SOP login, right? Because SOP is synchronous. Okay, so SOP login request size is very limited to 10 KB or less. Okay, and you can only make a maximum of 3,600 calls to the login function per user per hour. Okay. If you exceed this limit, you will get an error. Okay. So I repeat, you can only make a maximum of 3,600 calls to the login function per user per hour. Okay. So that is the limitation of SOAP API. And now you can the remote system, as you know, the API, you can create, delete record, right? You can only do up to 200 records at a time. Okay, so now that's okay. Now you can also use the query and query more call, right? Now, um, so the maximum number of the rows returned using the query um, is 2,000. You can explicitly set the batch size, okay? But there's no guarantee that the requested batch size will be the actual batch size. So uh, this is mostly due for the performance reason they do that, right? So this is just about the SOAP API, okay? Now, so the bulk API, right? As you know, the bulk API, right? It's pretty much optimized for importing and exporting large set of data asynchronous. Okay, so that's what I was talking about. If you're after, um, the bulk data, then you used to use the bulk API. Okay, so so now the master system could be either a Salesforce or it could be a remote system. Okay, so if the master system is a Salesforce, right, the remote system stores either the Salesforce record ID or other unique ID, okay, from the record. So the remote system, like in this case, the Salesforce is a master system, uh, and in another case, the order management is the master system, right? So in that case, right, the Salesforce stores a reference to the ID. So and order management, right? Order management does an order, right? So the order ID gets stored in the Salesforce, right? When the order management is the master system, okay? So you can do complex integration scenarios using that as well. Okay. Now you can also use the middleware, right? You can, if you are using a middleware, you have to make sure that middleware support a few things like event handling, protocol conversion, translation and transformation, buffering, queuing, synchronous transfer protocol. It should support. It should also have the mediation routing. Um, it should have a functionality of service orchestration. So it should do ETL for bulk batches, right? So this is one of the example of this is so you have to keep this into consideration when you are looking at the middleware. Okay, so middleware can be used in certain scenario. So yeah, that's pretty much what I wanted to talk about it. Like I said, it's an architecture discussion, and I'm not here to do hands-on. I will do hands-on when I talk about the Salesforce Connect. But you have to understand from a design pattern, right? So this is what I've been trying to cover. Okay. That being said, you guys have an amazing day. Take care. Bye bye.